Hello. Today I'm going to talk about the urinary system. And one of the big things that I will do is I will draw a lot of the images. Now, there is always another level to every system. This is meant to be just a basic introduction, as you would find it in an elementary anatomy program at a community college. And so that's the relative goal in this. So I will actually be drawing out some of the things, and I usually recommend my students draw out the pictures rather than just rely on taking pictures and looking at them. And so with that, I do want to start talking about the kidneys, which you can see here. Now, most of the images I use are fair use unless I mention that they're from KenHub. I do recommend everyone get a KenHub account. It is a wonderful program that shows you a lot of different things. But this one is actually one of the fair use images. And you can see the kidneys here. They are retroperitoneal organs, which means inside the abdominal cavity, you have the peritoneal cavity. The retroperitoneal organs are behind the peritoneal cavity. Retro means behind. And so you can see the kidneys here, and you can see that they have a huge blood supply via the renal artery. And the renal arteries are going to branch to segmental and end up giving you a lot of different blood vessels, which we'll talk about later. Now, what usually happens is blood comes into the kidneys, it is filtered. Whatever you can get rid of will be made into urine, and it'll go down the ureter to the bladder. From the bladder, it goes to the urethra, where you have two sphincters, and it leaves the body. So technically, the whole purpose of the kidney is to filter your blood, get rid of what doesn't need to be there, and reabsorb what you are going to want to keep. Eventually, the blood that isn't filtered or that is reabsorbed as well will go into the renal vein and in the inferior vena cava and back to the right atrium. Now, again, I mentioned that the kidneys are located in the back of the abdominal cavity behind the peritoneal membrane. That's actually what makes them peritoneal. Half of the kidneys will be below the rib cage, and that's important for something called Lloyd sign. Lloyd sign pretty much is if you put your back on the lower aspects of the rib and tap it with your other hand, if someone has a kidney infection, it will cause pain. And it is one of the Lloyd's test is one of the ways we can see if someone has kidney infections called pyelonephritis, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Now, the kidney does have a growth structure. It does have a capsule around it, a connective tissue capsule. And if you look at this, you can see that you have an area here, which is one color, and an area inside here, which has two different colors. The area on the outside, just like bone, just like the adrenal gland, uh, pretty much like most things, if it's on the outside, we call it the cortex. In the middle, we have the medulla. In the medulla, we do also have another thing that is important to look at, and that is you can see these triangle-shaped structures here called renal pyramids or medullary pyramids. Next, between the medullary pyramids, you have an area called the column. So I always tell my class to remember the renal medulla is like Egypt, where you have pyramids and columns. And the outer layer of the pyramids, outside the pyramid, so you can see a little dip here. You can see where the pyramid comes here. You have what are called the calyces. Now the small calyces would be called the minor calyces. Where you have these come together, you have the major calyces, and where all the calyces come together, you have the pelvis. So far, what we're looking at is renal artery comes in. It will end up giving blood to the entire kidney. It's a really highly vascular organ. Blood's going to be filtered. The blood that it is kept will go through the renal vein. What is eliminated will go through the calyces, the major calyces, the pelvis, and then down the ureter, and eventually the bladder, which we mentioned earlier. Now, the bladder has certain structures that you've heard about. Now, this one is from KenHub, and you have these folds called the urinary rugae. Rugae are folds just like in the stomach. You do have smooth muscle inside, and you have something called the trigone here, which is where you can see the pretty much the opening for the urethra. Ureters and the opening for urethra here. And so you see this triangle-shaped area. You do have two sphincters, like I mentioned, the internal and external, and urine will flow through the urethra. Now, the blood supply to the kidney, I actually drew it out here so you could see it. So you have the renal artery, you have the segmental arteries, you have the interlobar arteries, the arcuate arteries here, and you have the interlobular arteries coming off this here. And this again is from KenHub, because one of the things that happens is you have the functional unit of the kidney, and the functional unit is called the nephron. Now, if you look at this, you have the word nephro, and that's going to come across over and over again. What usually happens is you have the arcuate artery here, the interlobular arteries coming here, and they actually are going to give you a arteriole, and the arteriole will go into a modified capillary bed called the glomerulus. The arteriole will also come out on the other side, giving you the afferent arteriole, and it will wrap around the rest of the glomerulus. Now, after the glomerulus, you actually filter stuff in something called the Bowman space, which ends up leading you to the proximal convoluted tubules, to a loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubules, and then the collecting ducts, which I will draw it out in the next slide. Now, blood, again, it enters the afferent arteriole to form what's called the Bowman's capsule in a specialized modified bed called the glomerulus. So what I would do is I would actually draw a blood vessel here, modified capillary bed here, the glomerulus, and it would leave through the efferent arteriole. Next, what you have is you have an area around this, and together you have the renal corpuscle. The area around this would be the Bowman's capsule. In the inside here is a Bowman space, which would technically be outside the body. Then you would end up having a tube here, which would be your proximal convoluted tubule. This goes everywhere. Then you have another area called the loop of Henle. You have the descending and the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. And I'm going to draw this going out to the side here, even though it technically isn't correct, but you have another convoluted tubule called the distal convoluted tubule. And then you have the collecting ducts. Now, the collecting ducts will eventually go down the inside the calyces, minor calyces, major calyces. And this, called the efferent arteriole, will come and wrap itself around the glomerulus, forming another capillary bed here. And you'll have a venule coming out, which will eventually go to a vein. And pretty much all the veins will match. So how is this actually going to help? Well, one of the big things that I would tell you is important is to know that the medulla actually has more sodium concentration than most places in the body. And the glomerulus the loop of Henle can actually be either inside the medulla or just outside with most of the things in the medulla, but the capillary beds, the glomerulus, and the Bowman's capsule. Now, what ends up happening is this allows for passive diffusion and osmosis to occur in what's known as a countercurrent exchange mechanism. It is actually a facilitative at times, but we'll talk about that a little bit. So, as blood comes into the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole, you pretty much have a modified capillary bed with a arteriole leaving. So you have the afferent arteriole down here and the efferent coming in here. You do have smooth muscle around these two areas, which can increase pressure in the glomerulus. And so what ends up happening is that allows you to get a filtration through the glomerulus, which we call the glomerular filtration rate, or the initials would be G, F, R for glomerular filtration rate. Now, if you think about it, this is a modified capillary bed. So you have the simple squamous endothelium. You also have the basement membrane. And in this case, the basement membrane has a negative charge around it. So you're separating by size, then by charge. And then over the basement membrane, you have another layer of cells called the podocytes. And the podocytes make up the two layers, well, make up the inner layer of the the Bowman's capsule. And so fluid will go from the glomerulus into the Bowman space. Technically, whatever's inside the Bowman space is outside the body. Now I want you to think of when you took blood and spun it down. And you'll remember that it splits into three parts. You have the plasma, the buffy coat, and the formed elements. And in the plasma, you can actually separate the plasma proteins and the serum. So what ends up happening is the first layer won't allow the cells or the proteins to cross over, and so you separate everything that doesn't look like the serum. Then you have a negative charge, so any ions that are negatively charged will be repelled. So the only thing that's going to be allowed into the Bowman space will be the serum, and the areas of the serum which are either neutral charged or negative or positively charged. Negatively charged ions, molecules will actually remain and leave via the efferent arteriole. And that's actually pretty important because it tells you what you're actually going to see in your urine. At this point, it would be almost pretty similar to the serum. Remember, it just has a more positive charge, not negative charge. Negative charges tend to stay in the glomerulus and leave. So I did mention the proximal convoluted tubule, so I'm actually going to draw something, a stick figure, which I usually tell my students to do. So you have your glomerulus, your afferent arteriole, your efferent arteriole. You then have your Bowman's capsule with Bowman space inside. We then can go into our proximal convoluted tubule and our loop of Henle, which I will talk about in a little bit. And you'll notice that I'm actually not drawing it straight anymore. I'm actually rotating it. There's a reason. Now, one of the things that happens is 2/3 of everything that gets filtered gets reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule, this area here. Put P, C, T. It actually has all the glucose channels all the pumps for glucose that you can reabsorb. And they do have a maximum amount of reabsorption that can happen here, which means if your glucose levels are too high, they will pass the proximal convoluted tubule and it will eventually be found in the urine. Then you go to the loop of Henle and you have the descending limb, which reabsorbs water based on osmosis. What happens is, remember, sodium concentration is higher in the pyramids, which would be, well, technically it would be around this area here, than outside. And so as you start going into the pyramids, you are in a higher level of sodium. So water will actually be pulled across through osmosis. And it's in a gradient. So it has a higher level of salt down here in technically the pyramids than up here in the base. And so water will be pulled out passively. As you come on the opposite side, the ascending limb, you're going to be able to reabsorb sodium through sodium channels passively again. And so what you're going to do is reabsorb water on the descending, H2O, and sodium is reabsorbed on the ascending. It's called ascending because it's going up. After that, we end up getting to the distal convoluted tubules, and they come across here, and that's important because there's an area of the nephron here, which is called the juxtaglomerulus apparatus. It has juxtaglomerulus cells and macula densa cells, which are going to look at pressure and make sure the pressure is high enough to allow filtration. Now, anything that didn't get reabsorbed here will go into distal convoluted tubules, which are over here, the T, and the distal convoluted tubules will either absorb sodium or potassium. Na is sodium, K is potassium, and if you reabsorb sodium, you dump potassium. If you reabsorb potassium, you dump sodium. Water tends to follow sodium in the kidneys a bit more, and so when you are dealing with this, if you reabsorb sodium, you also reabsorb water, so you increase pressure. The kidneys, if you notice, are trying to maintain a high level of pressure, which we'll talk about later. Then you end up going to the collecting ducts, which urine actually gets concentrated because of the blood, and in physio, you'll actually talk about the uric acid reabsorption, filtration, and secretion. And then anything that didn't get reabsorbed will go down the collecting ducts, but you do have a protein called aquaporin, which can reabsorb everything here, so you don't get dehydrated. And so I did want to talk about the juxtaglomerulus apparatus. It does control blood pressure. It's more interested in maintaining high levels of pressure than getting you to go low. And so what ends up happening is the juxtaglomerulus apparatus, JG apparatus, monitors the pressure within the glomerulus. If the glomerulus pressure drops, it can contract and relax the smooth muscle of the afferent and efferent arterioles, and that will end up causing more pressure in the glomerulus, or less. If you relax one area, if you relax the efferent while you contract the afferent, you can actually end up decreasing the pressure. Now, if you do have low pressure, the granular cells of the juxtaglomerulus apparatus, which is part of the macula densa, will secrete something called renin. And renin is really cool because renin helps activate angiotensin converting enzyme. And over here you see A, C, E. And so some people may have heard of an ACE inhibitor. Well, ACE inhibitor inhibits angiotensin converting enzyme. And so if renin is trying to increase pressure, inhibiting the angiotensin converting enzyme will decrease the kidney's ability to increase pressure, and thus it's going to decrease it through a cascade of events. You do have arginine vasopressin, and also angiotensinogen, which gets converted to angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, and that will actually go to the adrenal gland and cause a release of a hormone called aldosterone, which goes to the distal convoluted tubules to reabsorb sodium, and so it reabsorbs water, all that. Now, the tissue of the kidney, well, in the glomerulus, you have the simple squamous epithelium, but the tubules around it, you'll notice they are mainly simple cuboidal, not columnar. They're mainly simple cuboidal. That's error on my part. Let me just cross this off. Remember, it's cuboidal, not columnar, so should be cuboidal. Now, in the bladder, you do have the smooth muscle, but you also have this tissue called the transitional epithelium. And what you notice is the cells kind of look like every type of cell you can think of. The thing that happens in smooth muscle in the bladder and ureters and calyces is they're constantly being stretched and recoiled, and so you have a specialized tissue which allows that to occur. The last thing I was going to talk about is something clinical. Now, I mentioned about how you have a maximum amount of glucose, sugar, that you can reabsorb in the proximal convoluted tubules. So one of the problems that happens is if you have too much sugar in your blood, you won't be able to reabsorb all of it. And so the glucose will stay in the nephron and it will pull water with it. And so one of the signs of diabetes mellitus is polyuria, a lot of urine. The other thing that you have is you have acute, you'd also have chronic renal failure. The difference is acute is it happened recently, it's only going to be for a certain amount of time. Chronic, you're living with that until the end. And so in acute renal failure, you have three types. You have pre-renal, asarenal, and post-renal. Now, if we deal with pre-renal first, that is usually caused by something before you even get to the kidney. Usually this is low blood pressure, such as what would occur with dehydration and blood loss. Now, as soon as you increase the pressure, that type of renal failure is reversed. The reason that does happen is A lot of times we do get dehydrated, sometimes car accidents, and so that can cause a slight degree of renal failure because of the pressure within the capillaries not allowing filtration to occur. I'm going to skip azorenal and go to postrenal. Postrenal is after the kidneys, and usually this is caused by obstruction. The most common cause is benign prostatic hypertrophy, and what it does is it causes a blockage of the urethra, and so urine actually moves up and causes a backflow in the nephrons, and so you don't have the filtration you need. And so you again have the kidneys not working right. Azorenal usually is occurring within the tubules themselves. And the problem with azorenal is the longer it goes on, the more likely it is to go to chronic renal failure. Now, the other thing to actually remember is that just because you have prerenal, the prerenal, if you stay dehydrated long enough, will actually start damaging the tubules. Postrenal will also start damaging the tubules. And so pretty much all of these can end up going to chronic if it stays too long. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and have a nice day.